This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly, Chapter 11, In the Bath. A few more songs and we were told to go with Miss Group. We were taken into a cold, wet bathroom, and I was ordered to undress. Did I protest? Well, I never grew so earnest in my life as when I tried to beg off. They said if I did not, they would use force, and that it would not be very gentle. At this, I noticed one of the craziest women in the ward standing by the filled bathtub with a large, discolored rag in her hands. She was chattering away to herself and chuckling in a manner which seemed to me fiendish. I knew now what was to be done with me. I shivered. They began to undress me, and one by one they pulled off my clothes. At last, everything was gone excepting one garment. I will not remove it, I said vehemently, but they took it off. I gave one glance at the group of patients gathered at the door watching the scene, and I jumped into the bathtub with more energy than grace. The water was ice cold, and I again began to protest. How useless it all was! I begged, at least that the patients be made to go away, but was ordered to shut up. The crazy woman began to scrub me. I can find no other word that will express it but scrubbing. From a small tin pan she took some soft soap and rubbed it all over me, even all over my face and my pretty hair. I was at last past seeing or speaking, although I had begged that my hair be left untouched. Rub, 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 went the old woman, chattering to herself. My teeth chattered, and my limbs were goose-fleshed and blue with cold. Suddenly I got, one after the other, 3 buckets of water over my head, ice-cold water, too, into my eyes, my ears, my nose, and my mouth. I think I experienced some of the sensations of a drowning person as they dragged me, gasping, shivering, and quaking from the tub. For once I did look insane. I caught a glance of the indescribable look on the faces of my companions, who had witnessed my fate and knew theirs was surely following. Unable to control myself at the absurd picture I presented, I burst into roars of laughter. They put me, dripping wet, into a short canton flannel slip, labeled across the extreme end in large black letters, Lunatic Asylum, B.I.H. 6. The letters meant Blackwell's Island, Hall 6. By this time, Miss Maynard had been undressed, and much as I hated my recent bath, I would have taken another if by it I could have saved her the experience. Imagine plunging that sick girl into a cold bath when it made me, who had never been ill, shake as if with ague. I heard her explain to Miss Group that her head was still sore from her illness. Her hair was short and had mostly come out, and she asked that the crazy woman be made to rub more gently, but Miss Group said, "There isn't much fear of hurting you. Shut up, or you'll get it worse." Miss Maynard did shut up, and that was my last look at her for the night. I was hurried into a room where there were 6 beds, and had been put into bed when someone came along and jerked me out again, saying, "Nellie Brown has to be put in a room alone tonight, for I suppose she's noisy." I was taken to room 28 and left to try and make an impression on the bed. It was an impossible task. The bed had been made high in the center and sloping on either side. At the first touch, my head flooded the pillow with water, and my wet slip transferred some of its dampness to the sheet. When Miss Group came in, I asked if I could not have a nightgown. "We do not have such things in this institution," she said. "I do not like to sleep without it," I replied. "Well, I don't care about that," she said. "You are in a public institution now, and you can't expect to get anything. This is charity, and you should be thankful for what you get." "But the city pays to keep these places up," I urged, "and pays people to be kind to the unfortunates brought here." "Well, you don't need to expect any kindness here, for you won't get it," she said, and she went out and closed the door. A sheet and an oilcloth were under me, and a sheet and black wool blanket above. I never felt anything so annoying as that wool blanket, as I tried to keep it around my shoulders to stop the chills from getting underneath. When I pulled it up, I left my feet bare, and when I pulled it down, my shoulders were exposed. There was absolutely nothing in the room but the bed and myself. As the door had been locked, I imagined I should be left alone for the night, but I heard the sound of the heavy tread of 2 women down the hall. They stopped at every door, unlocked it, and in a few minutes I could hear them relock it. This they did without the least attempt at quietness, down the whole length of the opposite side of the hall and up to my room. Here they paused. The key was inserted in the lock and turned. I watched those about to enter. In they came, dressed in brown and white striped dresses, fastened by brass buttons, large white aprons, a heavy green cord about the waist, from which dangled a bunch of large keys, and small white caps on their heads. Being dressed as were the attendants of the day, I knew they were nurses. The first one carried a lantern, and she flashed its light into my face while she said to her assistant, "This is Nellie Brown." Looking at her, I asked, "Who are you?" "The night nurse, my dear," she replied, and wishing that I would sleep well, she went out and locked the door after her. Several times during the night they came into my room, and even had I been able to sleep, the unlocking of the heavy door, their loud talking and heavy tread would have awakened me. I could not sleep, so I lay in bed, picturing to myself the horrors in case a fire should break out in the asylum. Every door is locked separately, and the windows are heavily barred, so that escape is impossible. In the one building alone there are, I think Dr. Ingram told me, some 300 women. They are locked, 1 to 10 to a room. It is impossible to get out unless these doors are unlocked. A fire is not improbable, but one of the most likely occurrences. Should the building burn, the jailers or nurses would never think of releasing their crazy patients. This I can prove to you later when I come to tell of their cruel treatment of the poor things entrusted to their care. As I say, in case of fire, not a dozen women could escape. All would be left to roast to death. Even if the nurses were kind, which they are not, it would require more presence of mind than women of their class possess to risk the flames and their own lives while they unlocked the 100 doors for the insane prisoners. Unless there is a change, there will some day be a tale of horror never equaled. In this connection is an amusing incident which happened just previous to my release. I was talking to Dr. Ingram about many things, and at last told him what I thought would be the result of a fire. "The nurses are expected to open the doors," he said. "But you know positively that they would not wait to do that," I said, "and these women would burn to death." He sat silent, unable to contradict my assertion. "Why don't you have it changed?" I asked. "What can I do?" he replied. "I offer suggestions until my brain is tired, but what good does it do? What would you do?" he asked, turning to me, the proclaimed insane girl. "Well, I should insist on them having locks put in, as I have seen in some places, that by turning a crank at the end of the hall you can lock or unlock every door on the one side. Then there would be some chance of escape. Now, every door being locked separately, there is absolutely none." Dr. Ingram turned to me with an anxious look on his kind face as he asked slowly, "Nellie Brown, what institution have you been an inmate of before you came here?" "None. I was never confined in any institution, except boarding school, in my life." "Where, then, did you see the locks you have described?" I had seen them in the new Western Penitentiary at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I did not dare say so. I merely answered, "Oh, I've seen them in a place I was in. I mean as a visitor." "There is only one place I know of where they have those locks," he said sadly, "and that is at Sing Sing." The inference is conclusive. I laughed very heartily over the implied accusation, and tried to assure him that I had never, up to date, been an inmate of Sing Sing, or even ever visited it. Just as the morning began to dawn, I went to sleep. It did not seem many moments until I was rudely awakened and told to get up, the window being opened and the clothing pulled off me. My hair was still wet, and I had pains all through me, as if I had the rheumatism. Some clothing was flung on the floor, and I was told to put it on. I asked for my own, but was told to take what I got and keep quiet by the apparently head nurse, Miss Grady. I looked at it. One underskirt made of coarse dark cotton goods and a cheap white calico dress with a black spot in it. I tied the strings of the skirt around me and put on the little dress. It was made, as are all those worn by the patients, into a straight, tight waist sewed onto a straight skirt. As I buttoned the waist, I noticed the underskirt was about 6 inches longer than the upper, and for a moment I sat down on the bed and laughed at my own appearance. No woman ever longed for a mirror more than I did at that moment. I saw the other patients hurrying past in the hall, so I decided not to lose anything that might be going on. We numbered 45 patients in Hall 6, and were sent to the bathroom, where there were 2 coarse towels. I watched crazy patients, who had the most dangerous eruptions all over their faces, dry on the towels, and then saw women with clean skins turn to use them. I went to the bathtub and washed my face at the running faucet, and my underskirt did duty for a towel. Before I had completed my ablutions, a bench was brought into the bathroom. Miss Group and Miss McCartan came in with combs in their hands. We were told so to sit down on the bench, and the hair of 45 women was combed with 1 patient, 2 nurses, and 6 combs. As I saw some of the sore heads combed, I thought this was another dose I had not bargained for. Miss Tilly Mayard had her own comb, but it was taken from her by Miss Grady. Oh, that combing! I never realized before what the expression, "I'll give you a combing," meant, but I knew then. My hair, all matted and wet from the night previous, was pulled and jerked, and after expostulating to no avail, I set my teeth and endured the pain. They refused to give me my hairpins, and my hair was arranged in 1 plait and tied with a red cotton rag. My curly bangs refused to stay back, so that at least was left of my former glory. After this we went to the sitting room, and I looked for my companions. At first I looked vainly, unable to distinguish them from the other patients, but after a while I recognized Miss Mayard by her short hair. "How did you sleep after your cold bath?" "I almost froze, and then the noise kept me awake. It's dreadful. My nerves were so unstrung before I came here, and I fear I shall not be able to stand the strain." I did the best I could to cheer her. I asked that we be given additional clothing, at least as much as custom says women shall wear, but they told me to shut up, that we had as much as they intended to give us. We were compelled to get up at 5:30 o'clock, and at 7:15 we were told to collect in the hall, where the experience of waiting, as on the evening previous, was repeated. When we got to the dining room at last, we found a bowl of cold tea, a slice of buttered bread, and a saucer of oatmeal, with molasses on it, for each patient. I was hungry, but the food would not down. I asked for unbuttered bread and was given it. I cannot tell you of anything which is the same dirty, black color. It was hard, and in places nothing more than dried dough. I found a spider in my slice, so I did not eat it. I tried the oatmeal and molasses, but it was wretched, and so I endeavored, without much show of success, to choke down the tea. After we were back to the sitting room, a number of women were ordered to make the beds, and some of the patients were put to scrubbing, and others given different duties, which covered all the work in the hall. It is not the attendants who keep the institution so nice for the poor patients, as I had always thought, but the patients, who do it all themselves, even to cleaning the nurses' bedrooms and caring for their clothing. About 9:30 the new patients, of which I was one, were told to go out to see the doctor. I was taken in, and my lungs and heart were examined by the flirty young doctor, who was the first to see us the day we arrived. The one who made out the report, if I mistake not, was the assistant superintendent, Ingram. A few questions, and I was allowed to return to the sitting room. I came in and saw Miss Grady with my notebook and long lead pencil, bought just for the occasion. "I want my book and pencil," I said quite truthfully. "It helps me remember things." I was very anxious to get it to make notes, and was disappointed when she said, "You can't have it, so shut up." Some days after, I asked Dr. Ingram if I could have it, and he promised to consider the matter. When I again referred to it, he said that Miss Grady said I only brought a book there, and that I had no pencil. I was provoked, and insisted that I had, whereupon I was advised to fight against the imaginations of my brain. After the housework was completed by the patients, and as day was fine but cold, we were told to go out into the hall and get on shawls and hats for a walk. Poor patients! How eager they were for a breath of air! How eager for a slight release from their prison! They went swiftly into the hall, and there was a skirmish for hats. Such hats! End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Promenading with Lunatics. I shall never forget my first walk. When all the patients had donned the white straw hats, such as the bathers wear at Coney Island, I could not but laugh at their comical appearance. I could not distinguish one woman from another. I lost Miss Neville, and had to take my hat off and search for her. When we met, we put our hats on and laughed at one another. 2 by 2 we formed in line, and guarded by the attendants we went out a back way onto the walks. We had not gone many paces when I saw, proceeding from every walk, long lines of women guarded by nurses. How many there were! Every way I looked I could see them in the queer dresses, comical straw hats and shawls, marching slowly around. I eagerly watched the passing lines, and a thrill of horror crept over me at the sight. Vacant eyes and meaningless faces, and their tongues uttered meaningless nonsense. One crowd passed, and I noted by nose as well as eyes that they were fearfully dirty. "Who are they?" I asked of a patient near me. "They are considered the most violent on the island," she replied. "They are from the lodge, the first building with the high steps." Some were yelling, some were cursing, others were singing or praying or preaching, as the fancy struck them, and they made up the most miserable collection of humanity I had ever seen. As the din of their passing faded in the distance, there came another sight I can never forget. A long cable rope fastened to wide leather belts, and these belts locked around the waists of 52 women. At the end of the rope was a heavy iron cart, and in it 2 women, one nursing a sore foot, another screaming at some nurse, saying, "You beat me, and I shall not forget it! You want to kill me!" And then she would sob and cry. The women on the rope, as the patients called it, were each busy on their individual freaks. Some were yelling all the while. One who had blue eyes saw me look at her, and she turned as far as she could, talking and smiling with that terrible, horrifying look of absolute insanity stamped on her. The doctors might safely judge on her case. The horror of that sight to one who had never been near an insane person before was something unspeakable. "God help them," breathed Miss Neville. "It is so dreadful I cannot look." On they passed, but for their places to be filled by more. Can you imagine the sight? According to one of the physicians, there are 1,600 insane women on Blackwell's Island. Mad! What can be half so horrible? My heart thrilled with pity when I looked on old, gray-haired women talking aimlessly to space. One woman had on a straitjacket, and 2 women had to drag her along. Crippled, blind, old, young, homely and pretty, one senseless mass of humanity. No fate could be worse. I looked at the pretty lawns, which I had once thought was such a comfort to the poor creatures confined on the island, and laughed at my own notions. What enjoyment is it to them? They are not allowed on the grass. It is only to look at. I saw some patients eagerly and caressingly lift a nut or a colored leaf that had fallen on the path, but they were not permitted to keep them. The nurses would always compel them to throw their little bit of God's comfort away. As I passed a low pavilion, where a crowd of helpless lunatics was confined, I read a motto on the wall: "While I live, I hope." The absurdity of it struck me forcibly. I would have liked to put above the gates that open to the asylum, "He who enters here leaveth hope behind." During the walk I was annoyed a great deal by nurses who had heard my romantic story calling to those in charge of us to ask which one I was. I was pointed out repeatedly. It was not long until the dinner hour arrived, and I was so hungry that I felt I could eat anything. The same old story of standing for 1/2 and 3/4 of an hour in the hall was repeated before we got down to our dinners. The bowls in which we had had our tea were now filled with soup, and on a plate was one cold boiled potato and a chunk of beef, which on investigation proved to be slightly spoiled. There were no knives or forks, and the patients looked fairly savage as they took the tough beef in their fingers and pulled in opposition to their teeth. Those toothless or with poor teeth could not eat it. 1 tablespoon was given for the soup, and a piece of bread was the final entree. Butter is never allowed at dinner, nor coffee or tea. Miss Maynard could not eat, and I saw many of the sick ones turn away in disgust. I was getting very weak from the want of food, and tried to eat a slice of bread. After the first few bites, hunger asserted itself, and I was able to eat all but the crusts of 1 slice. Superintendent Dent went through the sitting room, giving an occasional "How do you do? How are you today?" here and there among the patients. His voice was as cold as the hall, and the patients made no movement to tell him of their sufferings. I asked some of them how they were suffering from the cold and insufficiency of clothing, but they replied that the nurse would beat them if they told. I was never so tired as I grew sitting on those benches. Several of the patients would sit on 1 foot or sideways to make a change, but they were always reproved and told to sit up straight. If they talked, they were scolded and told to shut up. If they wanted to walk around in order to take the stiffness out of them, they were told to sit down and be still. What, excepting torture, would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? Here is a class of women sent to be cured. I would like the expert physicians who are condemning me for my action, which has proven their ability, to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up and make her sit from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. on a straight back benches. Do not allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her no reading and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment, and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck. I have described my first day in the asylum, and as my other 9 were exactly the same in the general run of things, it would be tiresome to tell about each. In giving this story, I expect to be contradicted by many who are exposed. I merely tell in common words, without exaggeration, of my life in a madhouse for 10 days. The eating was one of the most horrible things. Excepting the first 2 days after I entered the asylum, there was no salt for the food. The hungry and even famishing women made an attempt to eat the horrible messes. Mustard and vinegar were put on meat and in soup to give it a taste, but it only helped to make it worse. Even that was all consumed after 2 days, and the patients had to try to choke down fresh fish, just boiled in water, without salt, pepper, or butter. Mutton, beef, and potatoes without the faintest seasoning. The most insane refused to swallow the food, and were threatened with punishment. In our short walks we passed the kitchen, where food was prepared for the nurses and doctors. There we got glimpses of melons and grapes and all kinds of fruit, beautiful white bread and nice meats, and the hungry feeling would increase tenfold. I spoke to some of the physicians, but it had no effect, and when I was taken away the food was yet unsalted. My heart ached to see the sick patients grow sicker over the table. I saw Miss Tilly Maynard so suddenly overcome at a bite that she had to rush from the dining room, and then got a scolding for doing so. When the patients complained of the food, they were told to shut up, that they would not have as good if they were at home, and that it was too good for charity patients. A German girl, Louise, I have forgotten her last name, did not eat for several days, and at last one morning she was missing. From the conversation of the nurses, I found she was suffering from a high fever. Poor thing! She told me she unceasingly prayed for death. I watched the nurses make a patient carry such food as the well ones were refusing up to Louise's room. Think of that stuff for a fever patient! Of course she refused it. Then I saw a nurse, Miss McCartan, go to test her temperature, and she returned with the report of it being some 150 degrees. I smiled at the report, and Miss Group, seeing it, asked me how high my temperature had ever run. I refused to answer. Miss Grady then decided to try her ability. She returned with the report of 99 degrees. Miss Tilly Maynard suffered more than any of us from the cold, and she tried to follow my advice to be cheerful, and tried to keep up for a short time. Superintendent Dent brought in a man to see me. He felt my pulse and my head and examined my tongue. I told them how cold it was, and assured them that I did not need medical aid, but that Miss Maynard did, and they should transfer their attentions to her. They did not answer me, and I was pleased to see Miss Maynard leave her place and come forward to them. She spoke to the doctors and told them she was ill, but they paid no attention to her. The nurses came and dragged her back to the bench, and after the doctors left, they said, after a while, when you see that the doctors will not notice you, you will quit running up to them." Before the doctors left me, I heard one say, I cannot give it in his exact words, that my pulse and eyes were not that of an insane girl. But Superintendent Dent assured him that in cases such as mine such tests failed. After watching me for a while, he said my face was the brightest he had ever seen for a lunatic. The nurses had on heavy undergarments and coats, but they refused to give us shawls. Nearly all night long I listened to a woman cry about the cold and beg for God to let her die. Another one yelled "Murder!" at frequent intervals, and "Police!" at others, until my flesh felt creepy. The second morning after we had begun our endless set for the day, two of the nurses, assisted by some patients, brought the woman in who had begged the night previous for God to take her home. I was not surprised at her prayer. She appeared easily 70 years old, and she was blind. Although the halls were freezing cold, that old woman had no more clothing on than the rest of us, which I have described. When she was brought into the sitting room and placed on the hard bench, she cried, "Oh, what are you doing with me? I am so cold, so cold. Why can't I stay in bed or have a shawl?" And then she would get up and endeavor to feel her way to leave the room. Sometimes the attendants would jerk her back to the bench, and again they would let her walk, and heartlessly laugh when she bumped against the table or the edge of the benches. At one time she said the heavy shoes which charity provides hurt her feet, and she took them off. The nurses made 2 patients put them on her again, and when she did it several times and fought against having them on, I counted 7 people at her at once, trying to put the shoes on her. The old woman then turned to lie down on the bench, but they pulled her up again. It sounded so pitiful to hear her cry, "Oh, give me a pillow and pull the covers over me. I am so cold." At this I saw Miss Grupe sit down on her and run her cold hands over the woman's face and down the inside neck of her dress. At the old woman's cries she laughed savagely, as did the other nurses, and repeated her cruel action. That day the old woman was carried away to another ward. End of chapter 12.